Hi, I'm Bak Mortensen, Head of Exhibition at Royal Institute of British Architects. And while our buildings and galleries sadly are closed, we have moved our cultural programming online to bring you highlights from the RIBA collections, but also to show and produce new content by external contributors. And this week, when the Venice Architecture Biennale was due to open, we have looked at a relationship between art and architecture. And what better way to discuss this topic than with Sam Jacob, who will join me for the next 20 to 25 minutes. Sam was famously one of the founding directors of FAT, and since 2014, he's been director of Sam Jacob Studio, whose work crosses the boundaries of architecture and design, spanning curatorial projects, exhibitions, and even merchandise. Furthermore, he exhibits as an artist and are represented by a commercial gallery. So that's a bit of an introduction to Sam. So hi Sam, how are you?
I'm good, Marie. Hello.
Thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure.
So what have you been up to just briefly during the lockdown period? I know you've been pretty busy.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of weird. It's sort of quieter and busier at the same time. So like work's carrying on, you know, the studio's work is carrying on. We're bidding on things. We've got a couple of things on site, but they're sort of on site, which makes it more complicated. And yeah, trying to design some things. But then there's also kind of more time as well, because like obviously we're not traveling around, getting on the bike or getting on the tube or anything like that. So yeah, a weird mixture of more time and less time in a strange way.
I guess interestingly about, speaking about the topic of art and architecture, because it seems that artists are suddenly very busy during this time. There's a lot of need for them to create content online, and the pace of that is obviously very different from when you do a gallery show or museum show. So certainly maybe when architecture or the architectural practice is suddenly maybe slowing down a little bit on pause and construction, the artistic side seems to be flourishing during the lockdown, which is quite an interesting dichotomy. And moving back to the content of art and architecture, so the relationship between artists and architects or art and architecture are, continuously evolving. In the past, it was mainly unfolded as sort of complementary skill set and contributions. And a lot of these examples, we've got some really exciting manuscripts and letters in our collections from artists and architects working together, from Henry Moore and Leslie Martin and Jane Drew and Eduardo Palozzi and George Pace and Jacob Epstein. And now, to me, it seems like these two practices or fields are, merging even more, and the boundaries are blurring. And potentially, or perhaps the most obvious example is the Venice Architecture Biennale, and I certainly struggle to sort of tell the art biennale apart, from the architecture one now. They seem to be very similar in the way they create and produce the content there. And I was just wondering where you feel your practice sits within this trajectory of working between or across the two artistic fields.
And I guess I often feel like a bit uncomfortable, like calling things art, some of the stuff that I make. But it's not sort of architecture in the sense that like a professional definition of what architecture is. So I guess for me, the sort of idea of architecture is what I'm interested in. So it's more like a kind of disciplinary thing rather than a professional thing. That's not to say that we don't do professional stuff, because we do, but it's part of the kind of expression of ideas about architecture. But for me, a history of architecture is not only a history of buildings, it's a history of drawings, a history of books, it's a history of ideas about ways of living, visions of society, like how cities might be made, all of those kinds of things. So for me, it just feels very natural to be making work which takes different forms, like essentially kind of comes out in different media. And that sometimes means writing, and sometimes that means making a building, and sometimes that means designing a t-shirt. But yeah, it makes total sense to me. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult to explain to certain kinds of kind of external bodies, because it doesn't quite compute in the more straightforward professional definition of what what
And
architecture
how does
is.
that intertwine in terms of the output? How does that suddenly, appear? Like when, is that just sort of creative outburst that suddenly materializes in artwork or writings and sometimes merchandise, or is it something you're pottering about at home and then suddenly just pops up, or is that a collaboration with your studio?
Sometimes it is, Marie. Sometimes it is. I think there's like certain ideas that I have. Like one of the things I'm really interested in is the idea of architecture and representation, or architecture as representation. And in a way that has a kind of it's like a sort of two-way street. In some ways, it's about the representation of architecture. So that you might say that's drawings and writing and all of those kinds of things. But it's also like architecture as representation, which is like, hold on a minute, maybe buildings are just kind of one-to-one models. Maybe they kind of operate like drawings as well in a sense. So it's things like that, which those kinds of ideas which I think inform like all the different strands of their work. So it's like that's why it's possible for that idea to end up being a scarf, as well as it end up being like an interior or a building or a facade or something like that.
It's interesting when I read your text and when you talk about your work, you very much position that as you're doing just now within the canon of architecture history and architectural representation. But if you look at some of your works from people who doesn't know Sam Jacob, the architects, and just look at them in isolation, they would definitely read them as artworks. And it's also, and that's really what I want to explore today, and maybe talk to you about that with a different type of language as well. And but it also leads me into my next question or project, which again is about architectural representation, and that is Disappear Here, which is a show that we worked on together 2 years ago or 3 years ago when it started, when I commissioned you to do and what is essentially could be an artist commission translated into an architect's commission for the RIBA Architecture Gallery. And you were invited to respond to Sebastian Rosolio's architecture treatise and 7 books of architecture, and you looked particularly at the second book on perspective. So can you just introduce this show briefly and tell us why you're interested in this subject matter?
So yeah, I mean, it was funny when you asked me to make a show about perspective. I had a book about perspective in my bag, and that was exactly the kind of thing that I was talking about. It's like we often think of perspective as a kind of like a useful aid to a designer, or that helps you visualize your idea and get it on paper, or it's a default setting in so many like digital packages that you just click perspective and it puts it into perspective. But it's like many forms of drawing or many kinds of like kind of languages in a way, it has its own history, and that history is very specific. So I was really interested in the idea of thinking about the logics of perspective itself, what they might mean and how they might actually shape what we design, so that the tool is not just a kind of like a neutral thing, that it's not like a window onto another world, like completely transparent. In fact, perspective has its own prejudices and its own ways of imagining the world, and does a lot more in terms of organizing space and us than we would usually credit it with. So I was interested in the show and sort of like somehow making perspective, which is maybe the most natural feeling of like drawings which architects produce, because it sort of feels like it's natural, as opposed to a plan which doesn't, making it feel less natural, a bit weirder, and that's where the title of the show came from, which was a sort of like a homage to and fear of the vanishing point, which is the central thing, the invention of perspective, basically the thing which everything in the universe comes from or disappears into. And that became the kind of guiding principle of making the show. But yeah, as you know, it was also a show which used the RIBA collection, the drawing collection. And so a lot of the work was sort of looking at existing drawings, perspectival drawings made by very different people, you know, over many hundreds of years for very different reasons. But strangely, all of them using the same drawing system. So it was about kind of like that consistency that ties together, you know, you could say post, you know, from the Renaissance to now, in an unbroken line, almost unquestioned in architecture. Of course, it's been questioned in other fields. You could think of the struggles of the early 20th century, where artists are sort of rejecting the idea of perspectival space as the framework for representation, and that eventually you get to the point where there is no space in the painting. The painting is what it is. It's two-dimensional canvas with paint smeared on top of it, which is a very different, really different way of looking at you know, what graphic space might be. So it was about that in a sense.
It was quite, what I found really interesting is sort of delving into the history of it, and from the works that you chose, was to see that the connectiveness and relationship between other art forms and how perspective as a discipline evolved, and that sort of push and pull relationship from, sometimes it's driven from the architectural perspective, sometimes it's the arts that's taking the lead and informing architecture, sometimes performance arts, and that's that whole relationship where everything just seems so intertwined. And I've got 3 drawings to show you that was in the show. And they're poorly printed out, and you must be forgiving this DIY age, but they almost look like I've done some kind of artistic intervention on them myself. But I would like to show them to you, and it's not a test, but you know, for you to see what you think that these 3 drawings or architects have in common.
Okay.
The first one is this beauty here.
Yeah.
I'm sure you remember.
Yeah.
Which is Boulet and his ideal city for Paris. The next one is a more free-flowing sketch, Perspective, by Edmund Lutyens, a memorial. And the last one is probably the most blurry one, is an interior by Max Clendening from late 1970s. What do you think all these have in common?
Well, they literally have in common the fact that they use a perspective as a way to construct the space on the page. But what's also interesting is how different they are. So Boulet, it's like it's an imaginary building. It's not designed. It's not kind of thought of to become a building, to become a physical space. So its power, and it's a very powerful etching. Is its graphic quality, and part of that graphic quality is its intense perspectival space. So the vanishing point is central, which means that the big arch and all of the columns are kind of like visibly being sucked into that vanishing point. To such an extent that when you stand in front of it, you kind of have to position yourself in front of it. Like it kind of exerts a power outside of the 2 dimensions of the page. Whereas, you know, for Lutyens, who's much more interested in the kind of picturesque approach, he's drawing it on a corner. So, you know, the vanishing points are off the page. So you see the memorial, like on a 3/4 view, which is a really different, it's a very different graphic experience, but it's also about those 2 different ideas in architecture. And I suppose the third one, the Max Clendening one, it's interesting to compare it to, say, the Boulet one, which is like monumental, a kind of, you know, sort of a graphic monument to the Enlightenment, whereas the Clendening one is like someone like lounging around in a conservatory extension in Mayfair. so I think that's, yeah, what I found so interesting was that within the structure of, or the logic of perspective, there are all of these different approaches, and of course many more. And we also saw, you know, in the books that we looked at from the collection, so many different ways in which people kind of explained how to do perspective, and of course that changes according to, you know, their sensibility or that moment in time. But what we were doing, I'll show you a picture in return, Marie.
Yeah.
The way that we were using things, you can see this. This is the print that that you commissioned for me, and this has got in the bottom corner is a sketch by Hawksmoor from his sketchbook, which is in the RIBA collection. Then there's a design for a tower in the city, which was Lubeckian, I think. And then the one in the top corner is Palladio, a sketch kind of in perspective, but on the back of what is really the drawing that's really in the collection. And so they're all positioned so that they relate to the same vanishing point, which is kind of how the hang worked in the gallery. And so that meant that you can have, you know, an English Baroque architect that's, you know, I think 16 years old, I think was when that sketchbook he was making that particular sketchbook. You know, proposal for a modernist, a kind of corporate modernist tower from the 1960s, and you know, kind of a master of the Renaissance, all held together within the same space. And so the examples that you were holding up too, like Lutyens, Glendinning and Boulez, were also kind of held in a constellation, but amongst some others as well. There was Robert Smithson, the kind of Elizabethan English architect, and I think the Super Studio too. So you have these kind of, the way that we put the show together kind of defied the traditional conventions of where you would hang something on a wall, but obeyed a different set of rules, which was to do with vanishing points and horizons, so that you would have kind of, yeah, I think the best way to describe it is kind of constellations of drawings. But it might then mean that one drawing was hung way too low and another drawing hung way too high. But in a sense, what I was trying to get across, I think, was the sort of, was what happens when the power of the vanishing point extends beyond, or the logic of perspective extends beyond the frame of the page, and begins to influence others. And so it was about the kind of, it was about trying to show the difference in them, like clearly Lutyens and Boulez are different people, different moments in time, but also expressing, you could say, almost like, well, architectural ideas, but almost like national ideas. You know, Boulez is talking directly about a kind of almost like a new idea of what the French state might be. And Lutyens in that drawing is making a monument, or designing a monument to for the First World War. So they're both obviously also interested in ideas where architecture relates to bigger cultural ideas too. So however different they might be, they're also working within a similar tradition. So it was kind of that tension that was really important to.
Yeah, and I thought there was a really lovely dialogue, obviously across all those 500 years, but also it gave an insight to how architects practice and how they design, and what, going back to those three architects, what they all have in common as architects is that they all practice architecture as artists. So Boulez wanted to be an artist. His father would not allow him to be. So it means that within his practice, you know, it's fantasy architecture, the primary output of his architectural aura. Lutyens' background in fine art as well, and he designs, you know, in the round, you know, without any context, and almost like a sculpture. And Max Glendinning, I think what's really interesting about him again is that he, late in his career, when there was he did interviewed himself, and he says, I have always responded better to living painters and sculptors than architects. And I was just wondering, with that in mind, where does your creativity derive from?
um, I mean, it's true. I have stolen a lot of ideas from art, I think, and from artists. So, like, people like Dan Graham I would say would be very influential on like a way of thinking about architecture, basically, which is maybe what I find valuable is like, yeah, so it's an external view on buildings and cities and space and occupation of space, which is different from the kinds of things which, on the whole, architecture does, because architecture has, other concerns. It's trying to do something else. It's trying to, like, design the thing the client asked them to. But I've also really like things which are on the kind of the cusp between the two. So you could say a text like Complexity and Contradiction and Architecture, Robert Venturi. One of the amazing and sort of inspiring things beyond what he's writing is the way in which he uses images, so that you can have a Jasper Johns and a Michelangelo, kind of art and architecture together on a page. And that seems to me to be a very kind of just a really productive way to think about like what it is we're making. I mean, yeah, that in that sense, the sort of those moments where you have kind of multiple readings of the same thing, or you could say, oh look, isn't it interesting how the flatness of Jasper Johns is the same flatness as Alberti, and that suddenly means, oh wow, what else could you do with that? Yeah. So less siloed, basically. But things actually have a much more productive relationship between them.
Which is actually really nice leads into my next question to you, because I'm really fascinated by your blind spot series.
Yeah.
And speaking of French architect Boulay, it really reminds me of his Cenotaph for Newton. But also Fiona Banner's full stop painting. So they sit somewhere between architectural history and contemporary visual arts. And so I was just wondering, could you tell me a bit more about these?
Yeah, well, I started doing them before Fiona Banner, actually.
I know that.
And they were prints that I made, and they used as the background watercolors by Prince Charles, and these were just scans. Like, Prince Charles watercolors are pretty I mean, they're not that great, but they're expensive. But they're also interesting because I suppose they're Prince Charles's view of the landscape. So you get a lot of Scotland, and you get the Lake District, but you also get kind of like weirdly like colonial places, like views of India and so on and so forth. So there's a certain sort of idea of landscape which I think is represented both in the views that he chooses and in the way that he paints, which is a sort of kind of amateur romantic, I would say. And so I bought a book of his watercolors and kind of worked into them with circles, big black circles or squares. And in that case, they were sort of interruptions of that romanticized view of the landscape, because of course we also know the landscape is full of so many other and contradictory things. So that was the first series, and then more recently I've been working on like actual paintings. In this case, they're oil paintings. So they're like this. So this was a very, can you see that?
Yeah.
It's like a very sort of Bob Ross, kind of chocolate box view. In this case, alpine view. There's a sort of chalet, a lake, a mountain, and into them I've been painting these big black shapes. And now, so there's one like that. Here's another one. This is the Lake District.
And are these existing paintings, Sam? Or they...
Yeah, they are. They are existing paintings. So I'm buying these paintings
and appropriating them.
Secondhand paintings. And then I'm, kind of actually painting onto them. But the way that the shapes work is sort of to do with, like, partly it's pictorial and partly it's the logic of the page. So here is a good example. Like here, the top of the pyramid is the middle of the is the, you know, the center line of the painting. So it's sort of like it's partly the way that the pyramid sits in the landscape, but it's partly positioned because it's there. Others are like to do with the ratio. So it's like you know, it's like an offset from the outside of the frame, but then set within the pictorial space of the painting. So in that sense, they're kind of, I think the same, a little bit the same with the Prince Charles prints, is that they're enjoying the representational space, the kind of imaginary worlds which are sort of depicted, but they're also denying that as well. So they're like insisting on a flatness. So like it's not that any of these shapes are anything, you know. I mean, they kind of could be a data center, or they could be, you know, like a Amazon distribution center, or they could be, you know, 2001. So they're sort of, they're suggestive of form, but they're not form. So they're not.
Are they representation of buildings, or are they, you know, I read them as silhouettes or voids, or, you know.
Yeah, I think that's exactly what they, like, I always want them to have that kind of ambiguity. Like, it's not a picture of a building, like it's not an elevation, but it is potentially suggestive of that. But it never has any detail. It's always just solid black.
So and Matisse talked about using black to simplify constructions. So why are you using the color black here?
I think it's because it denies the sentimentality of the images which are, or the paintings which I've been using. So, you know, the black on the Prince Charles watercolor is kind of an aggressive move, and black in these paintings is also denies that kind of, it's kind of antithetical to the feeling, the sensation which they want to set up, that kind of romanticized idea of nature. Like this is just black, like unnatural black, you know.
But that, I find that as a little bit unusual, Sam Jacob, because you normally don't shy away from colours, and black sort of rarely appears within that spectrum.
Well, you know, Marie, there's a time and a place for everything. And I think, you know, in the context of a Bob Ross painting, then it's, you know, how on earth can you in a way you can't compete it, you know, in a kind of kitschy way. You have to become more like you know, Malevich instead.
Your Empire of Ice Cream series of drawing, they also employ this notion of disruption, and here is Fragmented architectural plans. And although they're very colourful and almost sort of innocent-like, they have in fact, like most of your artwork, quite strong political undertones and loaded with historical references. And I find that they're often related to power, capitalism, and consumerism. So I just wonder why these subject matters are important for you to express, not only through your artwork but also through your merchandise.
Well, those drawings are, they're kind of, in some ways, they're kind of almost automatic drawings. They're like drawn on graph paper using pens. So it's equipment from Ryman's. So it's sort of bureaucratic rather than artistic. You know, not from the art shop. It is from the office supply shop. Graph paper also, which, you know, which sets out its own graphic logic, but then into that are plans which are drawn from memory. So they're kind of often wrong or often half remembered, and almost always fragments. So they're never complete, but they sort of, on the one hand, they have pieces of, you could say, very important pieces of architecture which are important because of their place in architectural history, but also because of their place in culture, like the Pantheon, for example. But also kind of canonical, there's lots of fragments of Mies van der Rohe scattered around, but also some really banal things like doubly loaded corridors, which are just like generic, like it could be a hotel, it could be an office, but like really the kind of, the shittest types of space which we make for ourselves to inhabit, the least characterful, the flimsiest. And so in some senses it's a sort of mixture between like so many different references that are never fully realized, so that as you as your eyes travel across the surface, you're always unsettled. You're never kind of inside something. You're never quite sure if you're in or outside. One thing turns into another, sometimes quite abruptly. So in that sense, I suppose it's like it's more like a sort of surrealist version of Collage City, which is quite surrealist in the first place, but maybe a description of like an experience of the contemporary city, or maybe the contemporary European city, in the sort of amalgamation of the significance of history, but also the disregard of history, and that in a way that's, or the kind of edifices which have meaning, and that's really where the title of that series of drawings came from, Empire of Ice Cream, which is stolen from Walt Whitman poem. But for me, it was the sort of contrast between the suggestion of the kind of solidity and kind of permanence of something like an empire, and the softness and temporality of ice cream, and that felt sort of appropriate for like basically a world of total fragments, however significant that their kind of references might have been.
Quite a lot to be into little drawings, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, some of them got quite big, like A1, and in fact there is an A0 one which is underway, but I haven't dared to get it back on the board. I thought that might be a lockdown.
It sounds like a good lockdown project.
Yeah, but it's very daunting. It's so big. They take a long time.
In the run up to this conversation as well, you showed me your newest project, which is, I believe, called World of Interiors.
Yes.
Can you show us that? Or
yeah. So this is a lockdown project. This definitely is. This is something I've made during lockdown, and they're globes, kind of worlds basically, and they're onto them a kind of collaged or papier-mâché plans, which is essentially interior. So it's in a sense they're kind of companion pieces to the drawings that we were talking about, Empire of Ice Cream, but in this case they're not drawn, they're kind of snipped and pasted together. I'll show you another one. So it felt like I had this big globe lying around for a long time, wondering what to do with it, and I had already sprayed it white, and I kind of like the idea that maybe there was something suggestive in the sense that one way you can understand architecture is an act of making worlds, like a kind of a room is a world, a building is a world, a city is a world. It's a sort of an unnatural world, but definitely a world. So I had this globe floating around for ages, years, Marie, blank, like as if it was a piece of paper, not knowing what to do with it. And so I don't know. Yeah, I wrote something for Art Review, like in the first couple of weeks of lockdown, just about the experience of spending so much time at home, so much time in domestic space, and what that had sort of done to, what that seemed to be doing to me, and I assume to many of us, in the sort of change of perception of scale and time and all of those kinds of things, and the sort of compression of everything into such small places.
And
so this was a sort of then a kind of a way of like manifesting that idea. Like yeah, it was just such a strange moment where so much of the world was indoors, was inside, and so yeah, this was so these are worlds of only interior, in a sense, like room connected to room, connected to room, connected to room. Again, their references are mainly just like good looking, interesting plans. But that's that, in a way that's important too. That they're kind of global, they're like sliced through time. But yeah, so it's a sort of, yeah, it's kind of I guess a way of maybe expressing a certain sort of experience of the world as a world. Yeah.
We're nearly, running out of time, and it's just flown by, when you're good company. And but I just, when I see your work, and I sort of been looking at it, obviously, updating, your output from your website, I'm reminded of the phrase that say, "How can we know the dancer from the dance?" It makes me wonder, how can we know Sam Jacob from Sam Jacob Studio? What is it? Is there anything that you feel are sort of your particular personal expression rather than what is, your studio expression? Because they're all gathered in the same space. Like, what is it that sort of is Sam Jacob that is at its core? What do you feel? What would those projects be?
Like I think it would be, I think you can really tell if you go back to maybe one of the things I said really early on, which is that issue to do with architecture and representation, or the representation of architecture. So I think when you can see that becoming the kind of the thing the project is really about, then that's like me.
Yeah.
And that doesn't mean it's like always something which I've started. That does happen, in response to clients' briefs or to context, because of course, like it's a way of understanding the world. So it's but yeah, I think that's the sort of like, that would be my epitaph. Should I have an epitaph?
Well, Sam, thank you ever so much for taking the time to speak to me. And I could really honestly have carried on and asked you so many more questions about your practice, which, just really fascinates me. And I look forward to being able to meet you in person again, and to come and see your next show, or, Biennale, where you curate or present work, and and just see how it all evolves from here. So thank you so much, and take care.
Thank you, Marie.